My name is Anja Pelova, and I'll be taking over from Luca, and I'll be your host for the rest of the day and for tomorrow morning. We have a very exciting topics ahead of us. So we're going to talk about legal, taxes. We're going to talk about building a business, community. So please stay in this track. It's going to be very cool. And for this panel, we have an awesome group of experts who are coming all the way from Liechtenstein, from Slovenia, from the US. And we're going to talk about legal and taxes. So please join me in welcoming Joe Telpner, who is chair of FinTech and Blockchain at Sullivan in Worcester, Thomas Nägele, who is managing partner and attorney at Nägele Law. We have Matthias who is a tax consultant and partner at Actus. And we also have Anja Blaj, who is legal expert from Slovenia. She's from Unlocked, and she's also managing a few projects in the field. All right. So just to start quickly, I'm going to give you a quick icebreaker. Which one is first, innovation or legislation? I'll start from Anja.
Does this work already? Yeah, okay. The innovation or legislation. Well, I usually start with ubi societas ibi jus, which basically means in Latin that wherever there is a society, there's the law. So if the society moves on and if there's the innovation, the law is kind of going to follow. But I would disagree that the law should come first and then the innovation, because we simply don't know how to regulate it. So this is pretty much my icebreaker.
From a tax perspective, it's always that the tax law is behind the real world, and therefore, as a tax advisor, we try to put the legal framework of the tax law into the real world in finding some similarities.
My point is, in an ideal world, the legal framework, so law, actually fosters innovation in an ideal world.
So, especially early on in the blockchain space, a lot of people said that blockchain is so different, so unique, it's beyond regulation, or there are no regulations that apply to it. And I think that's fundamentally wrong. I think in most cases, no matter what we're doing in the blockchain world, there is an existing regulatory regime. But what innovation does is often create a mismatch between the technology and the regulation, so that the regulations may be there, but they may be out of sync with the regulation, and then with the technology, then we have to go through a cycle where we try to modify and bring the regulation up to the level it needs to be in order for it to work hand in hand with the technology.
Thank you. So crypto started as sort of like a libertarian philosophy where it was against taxation, against regulation, but slowly it's catching up with it. So my question for you is, why did you choose this field, and what made you interested to transition in blockchain, fintech, and crypto, and how your work is changing the field? So this time, I'll start with Joe.
So in 2014, I was sitting in my office, and a litigation partner called me and said, there's this company called Overstock, and they want to issue a security on the blockchain, and they want to hire us. Can we do that? And I said, let me get back to you tomorrow. And I went home that night and I Googled what is blockchain. And he came back the next day and said, well, let's talk to them. And so they came in, they hired us, and it took us 2 years to educate the SEC and FINRA in the US about what it meant to actually take a security and issue it on a blockchain. And by the time I spent 2 years working on that project to get the very first security issued on a blockchain, all of a sudden they said, wow, this is much more fun than anything else I've ever done in my life, and I was hooked. That was it.
Actually, I used to code software for quite some time, so I'm the IT guy and the lawyer. And when I started my own office, my own law firm in 2015, I actually had no choice, because in Liechtenstein you find 200 lawyers, which for our small country is quite a large number. So I had to find my own niche. So I started as an IT law firm, and then the first clients showed up. I was interested in blockchain since 2011, so I got the first clients, and they were happy to talk to me about the thing which I already knew, and they don't have to educate me. And the rest, I mean, from that moment on, I never had problems finding clients. My biggest problem is finding good lawyers. So I was by accident, actually.
That's a good problem to have.
From a tax advisor, it's very easy, because if you're looking about the future and job security of each profession, everybody says in 5 years there will be no tax advisor anymore, because digitalization will make every tax advisor unemployed. So I was very happy for some years as Thomas Nägele called me and asked me, hey, I have this cool project, blockchain project, we need a tax advisor. Do you want to join? And I say, why not?
I did not have a legal firm by then, not at all. I was a student, and there were a lot of young people that kind of went into this space, and pretty much they all had one single question: is the profit being taxed? That was back in 2015, 2000 and whatever. The same people came back to me when I was a bit older, 2017, and they asked, hey, can we buy an island? Can we have an ICO and buy an island? I was like, can we? So we called Bahamas and stuff like that. It never happened, so there was no ICO, there was no island. But that's when I got really, really interested about how blockchain works, and I kind of did the research about the global law simultaneously and the space law, and there's a lot of parallels. So all of a sudden we have a space, and I would actually say that if it's fully decentralized, if it becomes autonomous, it's going to be nearly impossible for the regulators to prevent or to regulate it in the way that we are used to. And those parallels kept me going, and that's how I got closer to the Ethereum community and got into the Koalas, which is pretty much a research group. And till today, we are still researching the area and finding out whether this is something that the regulators can really regulate and what issues we have.
And because this is the entrepreneurship track, when you want to start a blockchain startup or a business or an STO, ICO, or even trade with crypto, because you have to consider legislation first, even though innovation always precedes. What are the things to consider in terms of like where do you set up your company, or like how do you create your business? So what do you need to consider first? Maybe because you all have different expertise, so maybe you can give an answer from your point of view. Who wants to start? Okay, you can start.
I sent them to Liechtenstein and Germany. Yeah, there's a lot of things that people need to consider. So, for example, the ICOs were pretty much questioned whether the jurisdiction or the regulators already had a category, whether they had considered whether these tokens are being the STOs, whether those tokens are being utility tokens, payment tokens, security, whatnot. And then, of course, there's the licensing issue. And whenever we say the ICO, usually the project made something like a software or a database or a solution for a specific sector. So, for example, there would be an ICO that is doing a solution for the medical sector, and there is a huge bunch of regulation that apply just for the medical sector. And whenever you're creating that kind of solution, it's not only about the taxes, it's not only about what kind of a legal entity you're going to have, how do you want to function as a security token, it's also that this regulation is going to apply to your project. So you need to take into account quite a lot of things. That's one, and the other thing is that it's a mixture of all the jurisdictions. So by default, whatever you're doing in the blockchain world, it's actually on a global application. So it's going to consume all the jurisdictions altogether. If you're offering the tokens to, for example, Americans that I think we are all familiar with, all of a sudden, no matter where you're based, no matter where you have your own company, the American regulation is going to apply because of the long arm principle. So these are all the things that you needed to take into the account, and a lot of ICOs did not really consider those things. So that was kind of a fallback. And today we're pretty much, or at least I am, considering the legal entities for DAOs. So all of a sudden people are creating the organizations, the decentralized autonomous organizations, but what they don't think about is that we say organizations, but we have multitude of all the legal entities that are organizations. And no matter which jurisdiction you go, there's always going to be some variations. There is not going to be an LLC that applies to all the jurisdiction, and you actually have to figure out how you govern yourself, what suits you best, and then find out a legal entity that is going to be applicable for your solution.
That's very true, because also from a tax perspective, you have to keep in mind nowadays substance over form. That for me, from a tax perspective and a tax guy, it's not that you are kind of looking, okay, which jurisdiction is the best for taxes. You have to ask yourself, where do you want to live? Where do you want to work? Because if I'm living in Berlin and I want to stay in Berlin, it's not very useful to create a company in Liechtenstein, because sooner or later you will have problems with the German tax advisor and the German tax authority. Therefore, are you really able to move, and are you really able to move your center of living? That's also for me a very important question, to have a safe regulation.
Yeah, that's a good perspective. But also, can you tell us which one, because we talk about what is the best location to move when you want to start a company, so your answer is on point. But should you consider what are the worst countries as well?
It's the wrong question. It's actually, in a way, the wrong question, for two reasons. One, as Anja said, people assumed that if you just picked the so-called right jurisdiction, you'd be okay and you could do whatever you wanted. But ultimately, where your investors are located is going to drive the regulatory issues you have to deal with. So everywhere you're trying to sell a crypto or a coin or a token or whatever you want to call it, all of those jurisdictions really impact the regulatory treatment you're going to deal with. But when I say it's the wrong question, if we go back pre-blockchain, if somebody said, I'm going to start a business, what would we talk about? We'd say, well, tell me about your business. What are you going to do? How are you going to make money? What's your revenue model look like? What countries do you want to go into? Where are your customers going to be? Where are your shareholders or investors going to be? How are you going to monetize it? What's your exit strategy? All of those questions, were the types of things that people would talk about when deciding how to structure business, where to structure the business, whether you have one entity, multiple entities, and so all of these fundamental business factors, for whatever reason, people thought when we got to the blockchain world and we were doing ICOs, all went out the window. And that all of those questions became irrelevant, and all we had to do was pick the magical right jurisdiction, and if we did that, everything would be okay. And I think that was wrong. I think it was one of the problems we saw during the ICO craze, which is people forgot that what we were doing, we're building businesses. And the same fundamentals that apply to any business still apply and aren't different simply because you happen to be using a token as part of the business structure.
Absolutely true. I cannot agree more. And I think the first thing you should consider is actually start it in your own jurisdiction, because that's your home base. Yeah. You know the regulation, you know the advisors, you know the language. If that is not possible, cross-border from a legal and from a tax perspective is always complicated. It's an added complexity. But in crypto, there is every time you have cross-border. So as Joel already pointed out, where you want to do your business. So where are your customers? So find a jurisdiction where you have access to these customers. And there is no simple answer to the question, and there's no standard answer. I cannot agree more. You really have to do your homework. You really have to analyze jurisdictions. You really have to think about that. And actually, you should do that before you incorporate, because afterwards it gets more expensive, which is fun for us, but not for you.
Yeah, those are very good points, actually, that you guys made. And actually, it's good that we sorted that this is the wrong question, because now we know. Okay. And Thomas, because you're an expert also in the Liechtenstein Act, Blockchain Act, and Liechtenstein is mentioned a lot as a good location. Okay, going back to the good, bad location. I don't want to polarize things, but because I know Anja is interested, for example, like how can we use the Blockchain Act in Liechtenstein, and how can other governments use this as a good example, and what the other panelists can also learn from this. So can you share some of your insights?
I mean, first of all, I think We now have this Blockchain Act in a draft version. We have the second hearing in October. I will have a speech at 4 o'clock roughly, I think, this afternoon, to explain it in more detail. But what I see is that other jurisdictions are analyzing our approach. So they're analyzing it, and we do see that other jurisdictions are thinking of or considering to adopt a little bit of it. But also the European Commission was quite interested in our approach, and actually that's what we need. We need anyway in Europe. We should have a harmonized approach, but we are far away from that. So that will take a long period of time to get there. And I think we can learn from everybody, and I think that there is the best approach. I mean, I think whatever I see, every suggestion, every guideline, every day I learn more. And I think we have to be I think we should be open-minded and to accept other ways of doing things. And I think that the Liechtenstein one is a rather comprehensive act, that there are actually a lot of answers. There are a lot of definitions. So you find the definition of a token, what is a identifier, aka public key. And we thought of a lot of, even from the civil law perspective. And the approach was, and I think that's the thing I would like to see in other jurisdictions as well, not that you start with regulating because you want to stop things, you want to hinder innovation. The idea was really to analyze your framework and to have that token economy in mind, and then to think about what do you have to do to make that happen. Because I think the point of no return, that blockchain is key for some things, we already crossed that. So this will come anyway. And as a jurisdiction, the question is if you adopt or if you can deal with the existing framework, that's also fine. If you don't need to if you don't need to amend anything, then leave it as it is. That's fine.
So I will slightly then amend my prior answer, because from a capital market standpoint, or from the standpoint of security laws, no matter where you're located, you're going to have to deal in the laws of the jurisdiction where investors are located. But there are other things a lot of countries are doing that are very important for moving blockchain forward, which makes some jurisdictions better than others. So let me just very quickly give you a couple of examples. Clarity as to the treatment of digital title is important. So if we're going to enforce the rights, whether it's real estate or digital right to a security, any jurisdiction that's looking at blockchain and clarifying their laws as to the enforceability of that digital title is a helpful movement forward and may make one country better than another for a blockchain-related business. On the debt side, if you are engaging in collateralized transactions, using a blockchain for purposes of tracking collateral and perfecting its security interest in that collateral is a very complicated thing where a lot of laws in a lot of countries have not yet kept up with doing things in digital form. So if you've got a country like Liechtenstein or like Malta that's looking holistically at how they change all of their corporate laws to deal with our digital age, even if it doesn't help you from the standpoint of issuing your tokens, it may still be a good jurisdiction for a lot of other reasons because of the way that country has thought about redoing a number of its laws to take into account, our digital economy.
And Anja, I want to go back to you because I know you're also working with government, so maybe you can share some positive examples.
Yeah, sure. So we kind of established a blockchain think tank a year and a half ago. The point of establishment was that we have a bridge between the industry and the regulators. The industry was quite strong. We had people that created the Bitstamp exchange, for example. There was quite a lot of ICOs as well. And a lot of them were addressing the questions to the regulators, so it needed to be channeled. And in order to have it channeled, we've had to establish one entity that is going to foster the talks or facilitate the talks. And yes, I mean, I have to say that our government was very much looking into the Liechtenstein Act as well. The only question that we had was, because this is developing so fast, because it's changing so rapidly, is it really reasonable to create a new law? Because if there has to be, if it needs to be amended or changed in 2 years, then that's not really the best solution possible. But on the other hand, we had a lot of opinions issued by our authorities, And the problem with the opinions is that, for example, especially when we are talking about taxes, when you create a law, it only becomes valid when it's published, when the date is met. When you issue an opinion has the retroactivity effect. So it can actually apply to all the situations, to all the cases that we had 10 years ago. And this was kind of the problem. So because we had this entity and because we were able to talk to them and because there's only 2 million of us, that's kind of a good thing to have. We were able to talk to them and they now very much understand what the situation is. They do know what the industry needs. So it's good. In my opinion, that's the most valuable asset that you can have. So that you have the conversations with the regulators, you have somebody that knows how to listen to you, that knows what you need, and is open to have the dialogue. But yeah, I mean, when we were talking to people from the industry, they were actually telling us why they moved to Malta, why they moved to different countries. And one of the reasons was that even though we are small, we are a bit too big. When you go to Liechtenstein, when you go to Malta, their regulators, their lawyers are actually working like a huge family. You go there, everybody knows each other, and things are moving much faster. In our country, there's a process, and there's 2 parties, and if one party is going to suggest one of the changes for the law, the other party is going to go against, and it's like a bumping system. But I mean, it has ups and downs, it has positive sides and negative sides. But yeah, it's a work in progress, definitely.
Oh yeah.
Anja, let me try to answer one of your questions, and that's actually very crucial why we decided to have a dedicated act. In the act itself, the definitions, that's the thing which are really in the Blockchain Act and the amendment of the civil law part. But all of the rest, like the corporate law, we amended the Corporate Act a little bit, but there was not a lot of amendments actually necessary there. And I totally agree, yes, if you have a dedicated act, the problem is it will take time to amend it. And even in Liechtenstein, that takes time. I mean, the Blockchain Act is not yet in force. It was announced publicly in March 2018. We do have a democratic process. We do have 2 parties. And actually, to be very honest, in June 2019, I had a very interesting evening listening to the parliamentary discussions about the Blockchain Act draft. So that's not something which is for sure adopted. But I think what our goal was to have it as much as technologically neutral, as much as agnostic as somehow possible. But I totally agree. I mean, nobody knows if in 2, 5, or 10 years this act will be enforced as it is drafted now. I rather think that we will have to amend it quite soon. But I think the overall framework is good. So it's a point where you can start from. So, yeah.
One more thing, if I can actually add to that, is that at least our government, and I know that there's quite a lot of them also, are, because of that issue, thinking about creating the sandboxes. So that means that you don't really have the same regulatory process. It doesn't mean that there's going to be an act at the end of the process that is creating the certainty, but at the same time, a bit of uncertainty because you never know how the innovation is going to go. The sandboxes offer you loose processes. So they offer the industry to go through the process of, for example, obtaining a license, but the requirements for the license are not so strict as they would usually be. And it allows the regulators to, at the same time, simultaneously watch the process of the industry and amend whatever rules they're creating along the way. I do hope that this is actually going to be a thing in all of the countries, because I think that the regulatory processes as they are today are a bit rigid. They stiff the process of the innovation because we have them the way we do, because there's a parliament process, because we need the working groups to come up with the regulatory proposals, etc. All these bureaucratic processes, the administration, is the thing that needs to be changed in order that we have the innovation. And coming back to the first question that you posed, innovation first or the law first, we need to change both of them and we need them to cooperate, sort of.
And Matthias, because you also work in the field of Liechtenstein and German tax law, can you share your perspective real quick before we wrap up?
Of course, yes. You can see in the Liechtenstein Blockchain Act there is no taxation inside, so I'm very sad about that point, because we doesn't need it. That's the point why a lot of lawyers don't like the taxation, because in the tax law you have an economic view of perspective. So it doesn't matter if it's legally okay for something. For example, a drug dealer, it's not allowed in Germany, but it is be taxed. So if you're punished as a drug dealer, you get also punishment about tax evasion, because even if it's not legal, you should declare it to the tax authority that you have commercial income. Therefore, we always look behind the scope. So it doesn't matter if you call it a token or if you call it a share. For a tax advisor, it's the same, because you look behind of it. So you don't need a special regulation, because you always look what's the economic purpose of the transaction.
Okay, thank you. So we don't have time, unfortunately, to open the floor for questions from the audience, but all of you are going to have your talks later today, so we can do that after your individual talks. Thank you so much for your participation. Your opinion was very amazing and on point. So can I have a big round of applause for our amazing panelists? Thank you. Thank you.